further ado, our first speaker today is Tony Brancato. Tony has been a good friend of mine for about 15 or 16 years now. We play vintage baseball together at Genesee Country Village, and Tony's also a board member of the Rochester Baseball Historical Society. And he's going to be talking to you today about his research into the Live Oak Baseball Club of the 19th century. Take it away, Tony.
Welcome, I'm Tony Brancato. As Ryan said, started out with this playing baseball at Genesee Country Village and Museum back in '02. And what I wanted to talk to you today about is a small sliver of work I've done researching the Live Oak Baseball Club of Rochester. And so mainly what I'm going to focus on is two gentlemen and whether their paths in history had crossed at one point, their base paths in history, you might say. This is just a very one specific part of what got me going into the baseball research part. So in my world, it started out on the ball diamond. I'm somewhere in the middle row there to the right. Back in 2002, this is the modern version of the Live Oaks, wearing very historically incorrect uniforms back then. Dark green pants and green pillbox hats and block lettering on the uniforms and such. But for me, when I started playing back in '02, I really was there to play ball. That's about all I cared about. The history stuff was kind of cool, but it really wasn't my thing. I just wanted to play. But over time, I started to learn a little bit more about the local baseball history, started to learn a little bit more about the original Live Oaks, and started to get a little bit more interested. So what you see here, this is the original Live Oak Baseball Club. This graphic right here is from the Live Oak Polka, which is one of the first pieces of baseball music ever written, dedicated to our local ball club, who was started in 1858. And they were Rochester's first championship team in any sport. And featured right on the front of the Live Oak Polka is a fellow by the name of James M. Backus, and he was a ball player for the Live Oaks, also served as their scorekeeper. So this was some of what I had started to learn more specifically about my ball club, and a little bit more in general. After you spend many, many afternoons every summer for a number of years out in Mumford at Genesee Country Village, you start to pick up a little bit of the local history and see some of the local buildings and such. One of them that's important to me is the Livingston Backus House. And this is actually a short walk away from where we play ball. And this building was once owned by Dr. Frederick F. Backus, who was a New York State Senator. He was one of the early developers of sorts in Rochester before Rochester was a city. So he was a very big name back in the day. So looking at both of these men, you have James Backus on one hand, James M. Backus, who is a member of the Live Oak Ball Club, kept their scorebook for them. He was their team manager, which is not the same as you would think of today, the manager on the field. He was more of the organizer. And also he played ball for the club. And then on the other hand, you have Dr. Frederick F. Backus, very famous local gentleman, New York State Senator. And I had come to find out sometime later that he actually played ball in Rochester as well back before the Live Oaks existed, back as far as 1825. And additionally, he owns this home that is now located a stone's throw away from where the modern Live Oaks play. So the big question that I wanted to answer is, are these two men related? Because to me, that would indicate that we have a connection from our modern ball club today, not only back to the original ball club, but to the museum that we play ball at every weekend. And of course, the follow-up question, if they're related, then how? So starting out, I had Ryan Brecker that introduced me, had introduced me to Priscilla Astafan. She's our local baseball expert. And he introduced me to her through the email. And so we chatted back and forth a number of times, going back a few years ago now. And we talked about the Live Oak Ball Club, we talked about baseball in general, talked about James Backus a little bit, and finally did chat on the phone one time, and I was really kind of hoping that she would tell me, yeah, they're related and this is how, or no, they're not, and then I could move on to other things. Because I wasn't really that much into it yet, but I was kind of curious. So her answer was really that she didn't know, and that it was one of these side trips that she called in her research, that she always wanted to take these side trips, but it takes a lot of time to do that. It takes time away from the work she's doing, and she never really had a chance to do much with it. But by the way, if you go to the Rundell Library local history section, you'll find many resources there that might help you to find an answer. So what started out as kind of a curiosity quickly turned into something that I just had to go find out for myself. And so that's where it began. So moving on, I spent my first afternoon at the library not really sure where to look, how to answer this question. So I started looking through directories. I figured if I make a list of a bunch of people named Backus, I should be able to find connections somewhere, and maybe I can find where one was related to the other. Look through census records, historical society records, Civil War directory, and other directories, and came up with about 10 pages of notes, several hundred names. Some of them were duplicates, maybe a couple of connections. Didn't really know exactly where I was headed with this. So the next step I took was to talk with a librarian and ask if there were other resources available. What else can I look through? And so they pointed me in the direction of some online resources. One of them is a website called FultonHistory.com. This is a site where you can, there's a nice search engine there that you can type in a subject or a name or whatever, and there are old newspapers dating back into the 1900s and I think maybe earlier that have been scanned in, and so you can search these papers, you can find something, and you've got scanned copies that you can look at. Findagrave.com, this sort of took a dark turn really quickly for me, is a place that you can find cemetery records worldwide and burial locations of people. And it's actually a place that you can kind of get lost on for a while if you're not careful. U of R has a nice website also where they have records for Mount Hope Cemetery and Riverside Cemeteries. And of course, we're talking about people that have been gone for 150 years or more, so it made sense that that would be a good place to look. So what I did find after spending some time on these websites is that I found that Dr. Frederick Backus and James M. Backus both are buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. Frederick is in section G, which is in the sort of reddish color, and James is in section T, actually not too far from Frederick Douglass. So I had spent an entire afternoon at the library. I had some cemetery records, I had lots and lots of notes, I had tons of names, I had no real connections, wasn't really sure what to do next. Gave it another try the next day. And when I came back, I found a ready reference file, which is kind of like a card catalog, and they have a biography section where I started to look up anyone named Backus. And I found a bunch of them, but there were three that stood out to me. The first was Albert Backus. It notes that he was the son of Theodore Backus in Rochester. There was a Charles Backus, who was also a son of Theodore. And then there was Mrs. Theodore Backus, of course, his wife. And among her children was Albert. So I could see that it looked like I had the beginnings of a family here. When I looked a little bit closer, I could see that Charles Backus had a brother James. Great, that might be the guy I'm looking for. And he also had a brother Albert. So that kind of told me that most likely these two guys were brothers. Albert Backus had a brother James W. Backus. And that kind of slammed the brakes on for me at that point, because I thought, all right, I'm looking for James M. Backus. This is James W. Backus. Looked like my search is kind of stopped right now. But I made note of some other information I found. Both gentlemen had a sister, Mrs. Hines, Mrs. Rebecca Hines. And a couple other things that I found may or may not be useful. The wives of Charles Backus, he was married 3 times, and his last wife was named Isabel Mason. And Mrs. Theodore Backus had a daughter as well that was listed in addition to Rebecca. So still a bunch of names. Decided to change gears a little bit and start looking from the other direction at Frederick Backus. So I found online his obituary. And one thing that was interesting is that I did see that he had one surviving brother named Theodore. And I also saw, looking at the obituary for Theodore Backus, that he was the brother of the late Dr. Frederick Backus. So after about an afternoon and a half here, what do I have put together? I have a small family tree of sorts where I have Frederick and Theodore as brothers, and I have Albert Charles, a Mrs. Vervalen as a daughter, a Rebecca, and a James W. Backus. Not the James M. I was looking for, but it was something. So I thought I'm going to have to do something else. So when I went to the library that second day, after what I had done the previous day and finding that both men were buried in Mount Hope, I knew I was going to end up there. So I brought my camera with me. And when I hit the dead end here, I went on my field trip, and that's when the real fun part began. So one thing I found going to Mount Hope Cemetery, it was kind of neat to have the overall map of the place that I showed earlier that has the sections all lettered out, and I knew what section to look into. But section T, where James M. Backus is buried, is about the size of a football field, give or take. And I didn't have any individual plot maps or anything like that, so it was up and down the rows and looking until I found the name Backus. But eventually, I did find him. And you see here, the picture on the left is looking toward Mount Hope Avenue. Frederick Douglass would be well to the right of this. And there's a monument, a large monument in the middle. There's what looks like a family plot. You notice the railing all around it. And then there's one low flat stone on the bottom in the lower left corner that has the names of James M. Backus, his wife Margaret, and his daughter Madge. And some other sources that I had looked through previously did point out his wife and daughter and dates and things like that. So I knew this was definitely the James Backus that played for the Live Oaks. So that was pretty exciting. What I did is I put together a little sketch of the whole site and took some photos as well. And one thing that I noticed right off is there was a Charlie. There was, of course, James M. There was, in the top right corner, a Rebecca Hines, spelled a little differently, but still Rebecca Hines. And then there was Theodore Backus, who was shown as the father. That kind of got me really going that maybe James M. Backus was really the brother, not James W., but it's too early to celebrate. I wanted to keep looking. I also noticed a Julia Vervalen Taylor buried right next to Henry L. Vervalen. So the Mrs. H. L. Vervalen I had seen as a daughter of Mrs. Theodore Backus was obviously right there. And then on the center monument at the site, there were some engravings. There was Charles and his dates, and then there was Isabel Mason and her dates. And so that kind of locked it in for me that this was pretty likely all the same family. I didn't want to do my victory dance yet. I wanted to make sure that I had other sources to back this up, because although it seems quite logical that one plot of graves together with a railing around it would all be immediate family members, I was still kind of a rookie at this, and I thought that that's maybe not necessarily true, and so I wanted to be sure. But in the meantime, I wanted to continue my little exploring mission and look for Frederick. Section G, if you remember the little red area, is about 3 times the size of Section T, and it's full of all kinds of trees and hills and valleys, and I didn't have anything other than Section G, so it took me a couple of hours of walking around, and I finally gave up the search. It was getting late, it was getting cold, and I went home a little bit disappointed, but with really new appreciation of Mount Hope Cemetery. It was the first time I'd ever been there, and it's just a fantastic place. And also with the thought that I was getting really close to finding a connection. So when I returned home, back to the computer, back to some online research, and looked up some more obituaries. And I looked up Albert Backus, apparently the brother, or so I thought, brother of James, Rebecca Hines, and then I found something about James Backus as well. And the first thing that struck me is that both Albert and Rebecca showed a James M. Backus as a brother. So that pretty much, at that point, I think, clinched it for me. Additionally, I could see that, unfortunately for Albert, he died at the residence of his brother James M. Backus at 97 South Fitzhugh Street, not too far from here. And in the obituary for James, it does mention 97 South Fitzhugh Street as his residence where his funeral was held some years later. So that kind of locked it all in for me, and I don't think I did a real victory dance, but I was too tired. But at that point, I really felt that this was the connection I was looking for. But I also got another last little surprise. At the end of Albert's obituary, it mentions survivors and Mrs. Rebecca Hines, of course, as I expected, but right there it mentions a brother, James W. Backus. So that one little typo, apparently, in this newspaper obituary of Albert Backus ended up being transferred onto the ready reference file at the library across the street and ended up throwing me off track for a little bit. But it was definitely worth it because I had my answer. So when I take another look back at this, I can revise this a little bit, and I now know that James M. Backus was a son of Theodore Backus and therefore a nephew of Dr. Frederick F. Backus. And the cool thing about that is now that I found this connection that, from our modern live oak ball club that plays at Genesee Country Village, a very short walk from the Livingston Backus house, once owned by Dr. Frederick Backus, and I'm sure that James Backus spent some time there when he was a kid. So some of what I learned here, as I had already mentioned, is errors, misspellings, things like that. People's names tend to be spelled differently from time to time. Rebecca Hines was spelled with an I in most places, but her own obituary and her own gravestone spelled it with a Y. But most important, I think, is to find multiple corroborating sources to be able to link things together and not jump to conclusions too soon. Very easy to want to do that, but I wanted to make sure that I had it right rather than having what I was hoping to find. And certainly this kind of locked me into my interest in local history. One other thing that I found, of course, after I did the hard stuff, was that there are some really cool plot maps available online, and this was like days later, literally. I could have kicked myself. So here's section G, and had I had this, you can't read any numbers there, but it's got all those little boxes represent an individual plot. So one family plot might have anywhere from 6 to 12 graves or more. And the circled portion is 109, which is quite large. That's where Dr. Frederick F. Backus is buried. And when I saw this and looked at the map and the roads and everything, I walked past it like 3 or 4 times, I swear. I was right there, I don't know how I missed it. But also, I have here, this plot represents, this is section 97, or plot 97 rather, of section T. This is where James M. Backus is buried. So all of that image basically is one of those little boxes. And you can see, you can't read any of the names, but on the top left, it's Madge, the daughter, and then Margaret, the wife, and then the third one down is James M. Backus. And all of that matches the little sketch that I made, the photos and all of that, so it's good everybody got put in the right place. So as a follow-up, now I had kind of gotten drawn into all of this and kind of couldn't get away from it, and I thought it would be nice to find more of the live oak ball players. And I talked with Priscilla one more time, and she said, they do these theme tours at Mount Hope, it's really good. And I was thinking, oh, that's great, I can find all these ball players and give somebody this information, and then somebody will do a theme tour. Well, somebody ended up being me, and my friend John Foster, who's also part of our historical society. So this is a photo Joe Chirito took of us on our very first tour that we did back in 2013. So certainly if you're interested in learning more about James M. Backus or Frederick Backus or any of the other 15 ball players that we talk about on this tour, we're doing our 5th annual tour on June 10th, 11 o'clock at the Northgate entrance in Mount Hope Cemetery. And thank you very much. And any questions? I'd be happy to answer any questions. No? Yes.
Real quick one. Talk a little bit about the process that you used to get that uniform right. Because you touched on it at the beginning.
Yeah, I did a little bit. So if you remember the original uniform that we played with, it was totally wrong. And when the museum originally the museum owned the uniforms. And after about 10 years or so of playing ball, they were starting to get pretty ragged. So the ball players decided that they wanted to buy their own. So I knew of the live oak polka image, and I went through some similar process here and looked at old newspaper directories. I found a newspaper article that described the uniform when they had their debut with it. It actually listed the original manufacturer, who's long since gone, unfortunately. But using newspaper accounts, using the live oak polka lithograph image, we were able to piece something together. We actually ended up going to 4 different sources to purchase all the museum components. One of them was local, they did the embroidery, and actually a 5th source if you want to include the work that actually you did on you put the logo together for us, I believe, right? Craig Brown did too, yeah. So it really was very much a collaborative effort to get that put together, but it's pretty near a dead ringer for the old one, I think. Thanks, Paul. Anything else? Okay, great, thank you.